Welcome back to A Baker's Journey. Today we're going to be making rich, buttery, flaky butter flake rolls. So I'll tell you guys a story about when I was working at this one establishment, and I had a whole bunch of things going on. I had turnovers and danishes, and I had buns, and I had donuts that I was making, and all of a sudden everything just went nuts. So my danishes were proofing, my oven was taken up, I was mixing something, I ran out of something, so it was just a real big mess. What I really wanted to try to talk about in this specific point is that, well, the biggest thing that it just threw me over the edge was I overproofed my donuts that I worked really hard on. So I learned something in that specific situation. In that specific situation, I learned that it's a concept, and the concept is called mise en place. And mise en place means that everything needs to be in its place. And what that means is, before you start a recipe, take everything out that you need, measure it, weigh it, or whatever you have to do with it, and get it ready, because then you know you have it. If you don't do this, you'll get halfway through a dough and then realize, oh no, I don't have any sugar, or I don't have any yeast, or so on and so on. So mise en place is a very important concept to get into when you start baking, and it's going to be a key concept wherever you go, or wherever you bake, or if you're just baking at home, or if you want to do it as a career or profession. It can really make or break your career in baking, and it's just all about being organized. So one thing I want to talk about too today is how to develop a dough. To develop a dough, you need to add basically water to it, and when you add this water to it, you take two different proteins, and they actually combine, they form gluten, and this gluten develops strands or chains, and when these chains form, that's what gives you this beautiful structure. So you don't actually need to knead dough. So that's actually funny, kind of a pun. So you don't need to knead it, but kneading it helps out the process a little bit, and it starts hydrating the flour. So this gluten development happens. Without hydrating the dough, you don't have gluten. So when you, take for instance, you're making a sourdough, and then all of a sudden you take your flour, you take your water, you put it together, and you start kneading it. Now, really and truly, you only need to knead the sourdough dough for about 3-4 minutes, just until everything's combined, and you let it sit. And when it sits, it'll actually form gluten all by itself. And what this is called it's called an autolyse. Autolyses are actually very interesting to watch happen. They take about 4 hours. Most of the time you wouldn't add yeast or salt to an autolyse, but because sourdough takes so long, it's going to do it either way. And this will help the structure. And one thing good about an autolyse, it actually forms a better crumb and a better structure than any other way of doing it. So when you knead a dough, you're actually heating up the dough. And as you heat up the dough, you actually break down the proteins. When you break down the proteins, then you have a new structure. So in my videos, you'll see that I knead for 6-7 minutes, maybe 8 minutes, and then I let it rest. And I let it rest for 10 minutes. And when it's resting, it's actually absorbing this water. And when it's absorbing this water, it's developing gluten. And then I usually take it out, I give it a quick knead again, and then I let it rest and do its bench proof or its bulk proof, and then it's ready to go. And if you actually take your dough after your bench proof and you give it a little pull and you bring it out very slowly and gently, you'll actually be able to form a window. And what this is called, it's called a window test. And it's a good way to understand if your dough is fully developed. So we'll get into a little bit about the process of making these kind of doughs. So one thing about these doughs is there's a process called laminating. And laminating is done when you take a kind of fat, and you layer it in between pieces of dough. There is a technique behind it, and the technique is you want to use or keep the dough as cold as possible. Flake rolls are actually very forgiving when it comes to this. When you get into things like laminating puff pastry or laminating Danish dough or croissant dough, not so forgiving, but it's a good way to start off, is making these rolls and kind of understanding the process. So there's several different things you want to do. Is you want to laminate the dough. The first thing you want to do is you want to do a lock-in, and the lock-in, what it does is it locks the butter in inside the 2 layers of dough, or 3 layers of dough, or whatever, how many layers you have. And when it's locked in, it allows butter to steam when it bakes. And when it steams, you get leavening. Not so much with the Flake rolls, because it's a yeast dough. You also get the yeast leavening, but with puff pastry, that's why you get the separate layers. The first time I made puff pastry, it turned out it was a lot of work. It took me around 48 hours, a lot of resting times, because every time you need to keep the dough as cold as possible, but you also, in between rolling, you need to let it rest. If you don't let it rest, you won't be able to roll it out, and it's going to either break or tear, or it's just going to be almost impossible to do it with a rolling pin. Sheeters come in handy for that kind of thing, but at home we're not going to have a full-size bakery sheeter. So the first time I laminated, the dough turned out amazing. The second time I laminated, not so much. So it really does have a process that you need to follow, and if you don't follow that process, you do it too quickly or you rush it. Like I said before, baking takes time, and if you have time, then you can bake it. So anyways, I like these rolls so much because they have an amazing spring, and I don't know if you understand what I'm talking about when I talk about spring, but spring is oven spring. So oven spring is when you put it in the oven, and because of the activity that you have in there and the expansion of the air, the dough will spring. It does it throughout the proofs and so on and so on. But the thing with the oven spring is that that's where you're going to get the bulk size of your loaf. These specific rolls, almost even after doubled in size from proofing, they're pretty much even doubled in size again after the initial bake. And in order to get a good oven spring, there's a few things that you need to understand. So the first thing that you'll need is a hot oven, and a lot of my recipes, they call for baking things at 400, 450, even up to 500 degrees in an oven. You'll notice that you'll think that, well, that seems really hot. Every recipe that I've seen calls for 350, 360. In order to get a really good oven spring, you need a really hot oven, but you also need steam. So what steam does is it gelatinizes the outside layer of the crust for the first few minutes of the bake, and that way it allows for that expansion to happen. If you don't have that steam, you won't be able to get that. So I'm going to tie up this video a little bit. I just wanted to say, I want you to take these rolls, I want you to try to make them. Try to do the best job you can on them. How they turn out is how they turn out. They're going to be delicious. And take them home and bring them to your family for the holiday season. And I hope you guys really enjoy this recipe. And I hope to see you next time on the next videos. I just want to make sure that you guys like this video. So if you have any comments or questions, please reach out to me on the video comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and like our videos.